Well, hi there students, it's Mr. Verzat. Today in this video, I'm going to teach you guys basic video composition, mainly how to set up a shot. Your essential questions for this screencast are, what are the different shot types and how are they used? What is the rule of thirds? What is headroom and nose room? And finally, what's the 180-degree rule? If you use all of these techniques in your video composition, your piece will be professional, it'll be tight, and it'll be interesting. Because each of these techniques are pretty chunky, you might want to go back and review this throughout the class year. What are the different shot types and how are they used? A shot type is basically how you frame your image. Do you frame up close or far away? And we can break those into three different major types: the long shot, the medium shot, and the close-up. Now there are also different shot types in between each of these, each with their own purpose and why they would be used at certain times over others. But let's break down the long shot. The long shot sets the scene. It shows the environment and shows where your character or where your main focus or your talent is going to be. You can see in this image of the beach, we have a guy riding the horse. The guy on the horse is your character or your talent, and we're using the shot to establish where he is and what he's doing. Here's another example. And another. And another. And another. Now you can see the wide shot doesn't necessarily have to be with your character really teeny tiny in the frame. All it's doing is establishing the location and what the character is doing. So as long as we see the talent head to toe and the environment they're in, you've accomplished that. Now the medium shot, its purpose is to establish the character, what the character is doing. It's to establish action. Typically it happens from the knees or the waist up. Medium shots also show expression and emotion, but the action takes precedence. Here's an example of a medium shot. We see basically from the waist up, the character is expressing emotion and crouching in combat. Here's another medium shot from Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man's getting strangled by Venom. We need to see that he's battle damaged, that his uniform's cut up, that he's wounded. Here's another example. And another. And another. The third shot type is called the close-up. The close-up frames from the shoulders up to the head, and it's used to convey emotion and expression. Here's an example of the close-up from Batman. Here, the action and what's happening isn't as important as the character's expression and emotions. So ultimately, the character and what they're thinking and what they're expressing is most important. Now there are different ranges of shots in between these. We have what's called the extreme long shot. The extreme long shot oftentimes doesn't even feature your character or the talent at all. It's often simply to tell a story through the environment, to establish a setting and a scene. Next we have the medium long shot. This accomplishes what both types of shots are shooting for. The long shot wants to establish a setting. The medium shot wants to establish action. And so it combines the two. In between the medium and the close-up, we have the medium close-up. This is used to both show action and emotion. Medium close-up usually frames from the elbows or the shoulders up, similar to a close-up, except it shows action, it shows what's going on in the frame. And then finally we have what's called the extreme close-up. The extreme close-up, it's not so much to communicate emotion, but action in and of itself, to show minute details. It shows expression, but it's also used to show action, what you're doing in the scene. It's a great way to show emphasis in your scene. If your character's in a dark room in a dangerous environment, has only one match left, then you probably want to zoom in on an extreme close-up to just emphasize how important that match stroke is. And those are your shot types. When we critique each other's videos, use this language so that we know what shot was used and why. Okay, let's go to your next compositional tool, the rule of thirds. What is it? The rule of thirds is basically a guideline for knowing where to put things in your frame. The rule of thirds is where you divide your frame into thirds, 3 high, 3 across, and it creates a tic-tac-toe grid across your frame. Most digital cameras actually have a function where you can turn on this grid as you film. Intersections on this grid are called action points, and action points are where your eyes are naturally drawn in a frame. Studies show that the brain gravitates towards those areas. So the goal is to put what's the most important thing in your frame on one of those action points. That's where the mind registers, oh, this is interesting. Beginners think that it's important to put what's important in the frame in the dead center. But now that you know that the eye is drawn to different parts of that grid on a frame, it makes a piece interesting if you line it up on that grid. Here's an example of what this image looks like on the rule of thirds. Here is the ridge. We line the ridge up on one of the flat lines. The object that is important is on an action point. Also, it lines up on a vertical line as well. You achieve this by either framing your image in the frame before you even hit the record button, zooming in order to get a good frame, or cropping your image in post-production. I recommend framing it during production as you're filming. And that saves you work in the end. Here's an example of an image that doesn't use the action points, but uses the lines on the grid just to help make it more interesting. You can see that the horizon is in the dead center of the image right here for the sunset. But if it were framed to be closer to one of the horizontal lines, then it would be more interesting to the human eye. Here's an example of how you'd want to line up a close-up of your subject. People naturally stand upright, so you'd want them to line up on one of the vertical up and down lines. And since our mind, we're drawn to the eyes of our subject, the person we're looking at, you would want their eyes to line up on one of the action points. The figure in front of the sunset is the focal point. It's the main idea of the piece. So this figure lines up on one of the vertical lines because it's upright, and also the sunset and the silhouette lines up on one of the action points. Now by zooming in or zooming out, you can also control how close your horizons come to the horizontal lines as well. So any visual media where you're trying to capture an image, this technique applies. Now is it difficult? Nah, not really. The goal is to frame your image in such a way that it lines up on these action points. For example, the boat is the main idea, but also it's this island in the background. So they just lined up the different elements in the frame to be on these different action points. And in this case, it's okay to have more than one. Let's move on to the next one. What is headroom and nose room? Headroom simply means allowing room to frame the top of your subject. So for example, no headroom in what you're seeing now would look like this. What we want is to see the entirety of our subject. We want to see the top of their head, and sometimes you might want to leave just a tiny gap in there. Nose room means allowing there to be space between your subject and the direction that your subject is facing. In this shot, the subject's looking to our right, and there's a large gap of space between the subject and the outside of the frame. This would be a proper use of nose room. And this can be from a variety of angles. The point is at least have enough room between the edge of your subject and where they're looking so that it gives balance to the image. A big no-no is to have your subject facing one direction and all of the empty space behind them on the opposite side. No, you want your empty space to line up the direction that your subject is facing. Now these are just examples of people, but you can also have them doing something as well. This also applies to objects as well as people. If you're using the rule of thirds, your subject will be offset slightly to either the left or the right sides, and you'll naturally have nose room. All right, the final one, what is the 180-degree rule? The 180-degree rule is a guide for establishing spatial relationships between your subjects. It helps you know where to put your camera whenever there's action involved. Now, when there's action on screen, the cameras need to have a rule showing where they're going to be, or else your viewers are going to be confused. This uses what's called an axis. If you were to have two subjects, say playing volleyball or shaking each other's hands, there'd be an imaginary line between the two of them. Now, the cameras never cross this line. If you line up a shot on one side of that line between your two subjects, you never cross it unless you're going to do it specifically for a reason to create an effect. Let's look at some examples. Okay, so we're looking down on two people staring at each other right here, okay? The 180-degree rule means that there's an imaginary line between those two people. That's your axis. You want to set your cameras up on one side of the line. If you cross that line, that's a big no-no. You'll confuse your audience. The 180-degree rule applies to any form of media that uses visuals to tell a story. And our brains need to have some kind of consistency within that storytelling so that we can understand what we're looking at, or else we become confused. Here's an example from one of my comic books that I've made. And if we zoom in, what's going on is the hero right here, he's tanking a shot from a laser blast. He's getting hit with it. Okay, and look what direction our hero is facing. He's facing to the left, all right? So the bad guy is on the left, the hero is on the right. Look in the next frame over here, he's still facing the left. Down here, when the laser starts doing crazy things to him, he's still facing the left. And over here, and over here. And we finally see the villain, who's been firing this energy blast out of his robot arm. He is facing the right. So that is an example of how the 180 rule applies even to comic books. Now, in this next comic book page, I broke the 180 rule for effect. And whether it was successful or not, I'll leave that up to you if it's confusing or if it's straightforward. But what we have is this helicopter pilot, and he's kind of surprised. He sees this little guinea pig guy falling right through the clouds, and he's facing the right. Here's a little guinea pig guy. He's still facing the right. We're zooming in. But he dodges the helicopter by flapping his little limbs. Now he's facing the left. And then we jump right back to him facing the right again. I broke from the 180 rule for a specific reason to show an effect. But still, we closed it with being consistent again. So when you film, always think of the line that you cannot cross, everything behind that as your background. And you have all this freedom on where you can set your cameras up in front of it. You could be up close, far away, but you cannot cross that 180-degree line. And that, my students, is an example of basic composition on how you frame your image. Now, it may seem like a lot, but go back and study it over and over. You'll also be using this whenever you're filming, so if you do it enough, it'll become second nature. So I look forward to seeing you in class. Answer the questions at the end of the video, and take care. Bye.